to Leading in a Mosaic World podcast. My guest today is Michael Ciszwekski. Michael is managing partner of Camden International consultancy he started way back in 2002, whose work encourages leaders and teams to develop habits of reflective learning as a way to improve results and create operational and strategic breakthroughs. He has lately become especially interested in doing this with a complexity-informed perspective to help deal with the most persistent organisational challenges. In addition to his work with clients, Michael teaches on 2 certificate programs, NTL's Organisation Development Programme in the UK and an Executive Certificate in Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Georgetown University in the US. He has offices in London and Washington, D.C. And before he started the work he does now, nearly 30 years ago, you would know it for seeing him, he had 10 years as an investment banker with JP Morgan. Michael, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Susan. It's lovely to see you. It's great to be here with you.
Okay. Can I start off by asking you, around when and where were you born?
Yes, around when? Well,
I don't want to ask you the specific age, but it's just nice to know around when for context.
Yes. So it was around 60 years ago. And I did most of my growing up and had most of my formative years in and around various parts of the northeastern U.S.
Okay.
Including in the early stages of my career, as you mentioned in your introduction, lots of time in New York City.
Which was
during the 80s and 90s.
I'm curious to know, what was it like for you growing up in New York?
Well, it was a remarkable experience. I was a suburban kid in my youth, with all that implies in America. And so, in a way, was really kind of cloistered, kept away from it. Didn't have much opportunity to see the wider world. So I even went to university in the countryside up in northern New England. At the time I reached that early adulthood, I was ready for something different. And New York City certainly was kind of the pinnacle of difference based on what my growing up experience had been like. So it exerted a really strong pull on my attention as I was graduating university, and landed there and was just amazed, fell in love with the place. Really, really enjoyed my, whatever it was, almost 20 years in and around New York, as I was finding my feet professionally, and then shifting gears quite dramatically towards the end of that time.
Yeah, I'm curious though, because when you said with your upbringing, it was typical, and then went to university and things changed, because I guess you were right in the heart of the city. What were the key differences? What made them one different from the other?
In the retelling, Susan, as I reflect back on that period, as a youngster, as a kid growing up, I want to say that it was kind of sheltered, my youth, white, middle-class, suburban in America, by and large, right? Going to university, it was still a lot like that, although I was beginning to get exposed to difference in many ways. But it was still kind of that secluded, protected kind of environment. Although, and I will say I did study abroad and, those kinds of things as part of the university experience. So I was beginning to realize that there was more out there, right? But what's really interesting is when I landed in New York, right on Manhattan, working on Wall Street, in the 1980s. So it was a really go and explosive kind of moment in time, particularly in financial services. And I still, even being in New York and being in a part of a global financial services organization, it was still kind of a narrow perspective. I mean, it's one of those people, I say this jokingly, I'm not sure how this will play in public on the podcast, but I was one of those people in that time of my life who thought nothing that was worthwhile happened outside of Manhattan. So when I say it, even then it was sort of secluded and cloistered. That's was the mindset that was part of that period for me. And it wasn't until I had the chance towards the end of my time on Wall Street to come to London on an assignment that my eyes just opened up wide, and I realized, oh, holy crap, there's a big world out here that is so different and so much is happening that's not within the confines of Manhattan Island. So I guess, that's the narrative I carry about how I've come to be where I am at this stage.
I'm still probing along the lines of what is it? So when you came to London, you visited London, what did you see? Because it's interesting, and I think it might apply to a lot of people, that the world we live in, we believe this is it, this is everything.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, what did you then find when you went further afield to London that made you realize that actually there's much more out there?
Mm.
And I'm possibly asking you to go back quite some time, so it might be difficult to remember.
Yeah. The short answer to that question, Susan, is everything. It was everything that just started to strike me. Waking up in a new city, in a new environment, with the opportunity, with the possibility of new opportunities in front of me professionally and personally. It was really like the scales fell off my eyes. It was literally almost every aspect, considering living my life in a completely different place.
Yeah. Many years later, you did move to England, where you live now.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what is it that took you into banking in the first instance?
Oh boy, now we're edging into therapy here. It's good. So it was a default move, right? So at the time, coming out of school, so much of my peer group was pursuing some form of corporate life, right? So, and if you weren't thinking about going somewhere into a big organization, right? You were going to law school, right? Or medical school or something like that, And at that point, those professional degrees didn't hold any appeal for me. So I just kind of defaulted into the process that so many other of my peers, friends, and colleagues and others were going through. And it just, it felt like it was part of the next step on my path. There was a script out there that had been written for me, and that I was, following along each of the scenes, each of the little acts that were part of that. And yet, going into banking, I was not trained. I wasn't eager to become a banker, but it just sort of happened. And it became clear after about 7 or 8 years that I wasn't put here to be a banker. So I needed to find something else.
Well, I guess it took you a couple of years to work out what was next for you.
It really did. And it took a couple of mentors to kind of grab me by the lapels and give me a shake and say, you might want to think about something else. And these mentors were insightful enough to suggest me shifting careers into something that I never would have considered on my own. Never. And that is taking a step into a parallel track into the field that I'm in now, right, of organization development. I did learning and development internally for a few years before striking out on my own, when I say internally, in financial services with Morgan and then another firm later. But if they hadn't kind of grabbed me and said, have you thought about doing this kind of work? And it was like, not until this very moment, I hadn't thought about it. I said, yeah, we think you should give it some thought. And it was a real soul-searching time for me, because it was at this point where so many of the people I hung around with, both people who were friends and colleagues, were in fact committing themselves to continuing on the fast track in financial services. And they were having more success at it than I was. So I really had to go inside for a few weeks and ask myself, do I want to make the commitment that I'm going to have to make to keep running alongside these people who I've been with for the last 8 or 10 years? Or do I want to do something else? And what does it mean? What's going to happen to these other relationships and the way that they think of me and I think of myself if I take this other step? So it was a really trying time, but I'm ever grateful that those two mentors who I still carry with me asked me the question.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, as you said, you've been doing one thing for a number of years. There's a clear path. You can see people succeeding,
Right.
but you're not really enjoying it. I can imagine how easy it would have been to just continue and just, well, this is a career path. And so I guess it's fortunate that you had people around you that could tell you that do something different, because it can't be easy to just change path.
It's not. No, it isn't. I was lucky, in that I kind of had a soft landing in making that shift because I was able to stay with the organization I was already part of, and just move laterally, I guess we would say, in current language, into a different part of the organization. But it was an environment I knew it with me was reasonably comfortable, and so I say it was kind of a soft landing. And I was lucky that way. But it was a dramatic redefinition, right, of myself professionally.
And I'm just thinking, because you then went external, started working independently. As you've been doing for the past 30 years. What made you decide to make that shift?
It didn't take long, actually. When I started doing learning and development work internally, part of that work was, of course, contracting with outside people who would come in and do some of the work. And so I got to know them and understood more about how they were going about doing their work. It became clear to me that it was only a matter of time before I found a way to go out on my own. And it seemed like the next logical step in my commitment to being in this field that I'm in now.
And just thinking about your work as it's evolved with learning and development, organisation development, there are a few things that I know about your work that stands out.
Well,
one is you've done a fair amount of work with white men, and it's interesting. You mentioned earlier that you were in an environment which was very white middle class, and you've then got to the stage whereby in recent years you've done some work about white men. Can you tell me more about what it is that you've done in relation to white men and their role within society and the workspace?
Sure. There are a couple of things, I guess, I want to say about that as we're getting started on the topic, Susan. One is, for me as a white person, feels like a new awareness, societal level awareness, particularly in the countries I live in the US and the UK, about racial justice. And I'm a little bit, I want to be a little bit cautious with categorizing it as new, right? It's only new to people like me who have been paying attention to it over a lifetime. And I know that I have friends and colleagues, you included, right, whose whole life is bound up in issues of racial justice in various forms. So I want to be careful about how I characterize the work that's been happening. But the point I want to make is it's been a somewhat recent aspect of my professional and personal makeup. And of course, with the George Floyd murder in the U.S., that was a catalyst for so much of what's happening. And as part of that, what's become clear to me is that if we're going to make the changes that we say we want to make in our respective societies, people who look and sound like me have to really be in the forefront of the work. And I started to come to that realization even a little bit before all of the upset that happened in response to the George Floyd murder, because I've been, as you mentioned in the introduction, I've been teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion certificate program at Georgetown University in the US, and started in that role 2 or 3 years, I think, before the George Floyd murder. As part of that, the awareness was building in me, right, as one of the few white faculty members working with communities of people who are professionally required to be doing work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The penny started to drop about how important it is for me as a white man to be in those conversations, to not say, well, that's other people's work to do. And when it's done, let me know and I'll catch up, which can be one of the default positions that we as white men take. So that's one thing, kind of the larger awareness about how important it is that I find a voice, which I'm still working on developing. But I expect it'll be work that I do until I'm gone. And then the other thing is, which I think you were alluding to a little bit in your question, is some work that I've been doing for the last two years and a bit in something that we're calling White Men's Conversations. And it's an effort that a colleague, Peter Rowland, and I starting up early days in the pandemic. We decided that as part of our contribution to all of the work that was going on and that was springing up in different ways, we wanted to bring a small group of white men together to do some work. And I say with some joy, we've been at it with the same small core group of white men for 2.5 years. We'll meet every other week for an hour and a half to talk about issues that we face in our lives, primarily relating to race and gender, but also it's a conversation group as well for other issues and concerns that we have as men trying to live our lives as best we can.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, and there's so many questions that come to mind.
I'm sure I went on a bit there. I'm sorry.
No, that was useful. It was useful to hear. All right, the first thing is, you mentioned the fact that white men need to be involved in the conversation for us to be able to achieve the changes that we need to make. Two things that immediately come to mind. What are the changes that we need to make, and why do white men need to be those in the fore?
So sitting where we do, white men at the top of the privilege pyramid, it's too easy for us to kind of sit back and think this is somebody else's work to do. I'm not a racist. I'm not prejudiced. I don't have bias. I mean, look at me. I'm sitting here in a conversation with a Black woman. I mean, tick the box. Here I am. I'm a good guy, and that's just too easy. And I don't want to sound like a cliche here, but the changes are about doing what needs to be done for the places we all hang out in, organizations, groups, clubs, whatever, for them to become more genuinely inclusive, right? That people who don't look like me feel welcome and a sense of belonging, whatever that means, right? And that's part of the challenge, of course, is that inclusion and belonging is a very individual sensation, right? So part of the hard work is negotiating that all the time, right? With everyone in every circumstance we find ourselves. And as relationships build, of course, we can relax and start to understand ourselves and others a little bit better. That's inherent in being in a relationship. But you also know, if you've been in any relationship of any length, there are times when the negotiation needs to happen again because there's been a split or somebody's in a new world, a new environment, something has changed. That's what I mean by the changes or not, I guess that's what I'd say in response to the question about, what are the changes? As white men, we have to be involved, right? And we have to be engaged, willingly engaged in these conversations. And I think this is part of what we've been discovering in white men's conversations, right? There is an assumption in a lot of organizations that white men are already at the point of being willing to engage, right, in whatever the work is, in the interactions and conversations. And we think that that's a false assumption. And some of at least the anecdotal evidence I'm aware of would bear that out, right? That white men as a group, right? Now, of course, there are individual exceptions, but white men as a group aren't yet willing to do what's necessary to start dismantling all of the aspects of white supremacy that need to be dismantled in order for our organizations and our environments and groups and our society to be more inclusive and to have everyone to have a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And so, part of the work is figuring out what needs to happen beforehand, right? So that white men are willing participants in the engagement.
No, thank you. I mean, that whole thing about when it comes to what needs to be done, it's at a very basic level. It's creating an environment where everyone feels that they're included and they feel a sense of belonging. And because in broad terms, white men are at the top when it comes to privilege, and there is that rich diversity of white men whereby some might say, I'm not as privileged as you think. But in broad terms, because they are in that position, then they're the people that are best able to help bring about the changes to enable that sense of inclusion and belonging, if I've understood that correctly. And I'm just thinking, what's in it for white men? Because we're asking white men to change. We're saying you're privileged. Aren't we saying give up your privilege? And why should they? What's in it for them?
Yeah, and this is an interesting dilemma, because this is how it often gets characterized, what you've just said. I mean, what we're trying to do in our small way, the seven of us, and we're in white men's conversations right now, is to challenge some of those underlying assumptions, in the way that you set this up, Susan, which is how we do set it up. In order for me to change, I automatically assume I have to give something up, right? If I've got it and you want it, that means, there's some kind of trading that has to go on, or somehow I wind up with less. And I believe that that's a false assumption, because what we find, and again, I don't have data, we haven't done studies on this, and if there are studies out there, I'm not aware of them, but anecdotally and, kind of at the intuitive level, the pie is not finite, you know what I mean? And so if we are in a conversation about how to make our small part of the world more inclusive, to expand things, I don't want to sound like a greeting card here, or make an entire cliche, but there's more for everyone in that way. If I bring difference into my world, I'm going to be richer for it. And the old example that this conversation often brings to mind is that it's about unintended consequences, but in a beneficial way. So maybe unintended benefits that come from being more inclusive. And the example is curb cuts, on city streets where the curb line has been reduced. So people who are differently abled, right, can push their wheelchairs up. It's easier for them to cross the street, right? Fact of the matter is, we all benefit from that change, from that inclusive act that was done, right? Because it's easier for me if I'm wheeling something along, it's easier for me to pull a suitcase along, or push a suitcase up and down the city street, because those curb cuts exist. So, that kind of, it's a real small but tangible example of how creating a world that's more inclusive benefits everyone. So a big part of the work for us as white men is getting ourselves past the notion, or figuring out how to give up on the notion that making the world better for you is going to cost me something. I mean, it's not cost me effort. right? It's going to cost me asking some hard questions about how I view the world. But in the end, I think many wind up on much better points.
Yes.
Does that sound too airy-fairy, too idealistic? I mean, I have to be careful because my Piscean self kind of gets going when we have these conversations and I get really idealistic. So
Yeah.
wheel me in a little bit.
I'm just thinking, if I was a white man, middle class, working class man, listening to this, I'm not sure I would still understand how it benefits me to make space or to be more inclusive of people of color, of women, of other people. And I'd love if there's some way of making that living where it gives that man that aha, whereby he thinks, yes, I need to start having these conversations so that we can become more inclusive.
Yeah, and
and in other way, I guess I'm asking you for some direct insights from the conversations your group of white men have had.
Yeah. I'd love to have the pithy, easy to grasp, one sentence answer to that challenge that you've just laid down, Susan. And it's the right challenge, right? But I don't have one, I'm sorry to say. Let me try to answer it this way, which I'm sure is going to be very unsatisfactory to you and you in the white body that you're pretending to inhabit yet. It's about building relationships. And so there's no easy answer or quick fix to that because building relationships takes time. And what we're finding that we think is working in white men's conversations is white men building relationships with each other is making a difference in the way that we as white men see ourselves. And then as a result, I hope, has an impact on the way we go out and act in the world. Something else about your challenge. There's a difference, an important difference between my individual circumstances as Michael and all that entails and what it means for me as Michael to be part of a group called White Men. Right. And it's not about choosing one or over the other, right? We have to get better at, as white men, not only demanding that we be seen as the individuals that we are, which is all you and others are asking for, right? To be seen as the individuals that we are. But we have to stop defaulting into that mindset. And at the same time, be willing to see ourselves and acknowledge that we are part of this group called white men with all that implies, right? That even, my brother, one of my brothers who works as a laborer, and would be the person that you've just characterized, Susan, the one who says, what are you talking about, privilege? Every day is a struggle for me. So, I can look around and see people who don't look like me, who are far better off in the world. Yes, true. Absolutely true. And that doesn't take away the parts of your identity that are wrapped up in the groupness of being a white man. And so the work of building relationships with white men as white men starts to make a difference because we are able to perceive ourselves just that little bit differently. But I think flavors the interactions that we have when we're
in some ways, that almost comes back to that thing about therapy that you mentioned. Or there's something about white men needing to unpack who they are. And then, having unpacked who they are, see themselves in the space of a group.
You've exactly put your finger on it. And that, we are in the West anyway. In 2 countries I inhabit, we white men are trained from our very earliest days to be individuals, to be the breadwinner, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to be the rugged individual who solves problems. And so from our very earliest days, right, we don't learn to understand what it means to be part of a group, to have a group level identity. And so that's an important piece of work that we have to do. And that's a big part of what we're doing in white men's conversation. We don't feel so alone as white men, which I know probably sounds bizarre to somebody who's not a white man, but it is an aspect of our existence that is often buried and unconscious, right? Not something that we're aware of, but helping us to see that we're not alone. And I don't need to sound pathetic. I realize that also has a risk of sounding pathetic. So please listeners don't think, oh, woe is me as a white man. That's not what I'm saying here, but the importance of building these relationships, right, as part of expanding our sense of who we are and what we can and need to do as a result of that awareness is really foundational.
And it doesn't sound pathetic to me, especially as in recent times I've heard of things like incels and the concerns around people like Andrew Tate, whereby there is something about the changing role and expectations of men trying to find their space.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want the exception to define the rule here. Incels and Andrew Tate, I think they're way out on the end of the continuum. And I think you're right. There are some valuable lessons that we can extract, or things that we ought to ask some questions about to see whether or not it makes sense to pay attention differently to some of the challenges that we face.
In some ways, that almost leads into a lot of the work that you're now doing. When you talk about complexity and being complexity informed, because all the things we've been speaking about and so many things in the space are complex. So how do you believe we need to be able to effectively navigate that challenge, that complexity?
So very nice transition, Susan. That's it's well done and quite on point, actually. Really, I feel like I'm in the earliest stages of sort of being able to get my mind and arms around what this complexity informed perspective is. But the thing, someone's becoming clear to me when I think about collections of human beings, right, being complex adaptive systems, to use some of the lingo. People have done a lot more thinking about this than I have. Stress a small handful of things, but they're so important. One is, as we've been talking about, is the importance of relationship, that everything is relational. The second thing is the centrality of context. So people who work with me hear me say all the time, context is everything. You and I are having this conversation now in this moment. If this was a different moment, we'd be having a different conversation, right? Because the context would somehow be different. And from a work and process standpoint, and I think trying to bring it back a little bit more to the work we're doing with white men, it makes context and the importance of relationship make the present moment, and being able to pay exquisite attention to the present moment, the real essence of the work, right? So what's happening right now? Let's not worry about so much about the past to try to find blame. Whose fault is this, right? Let's look behind us and try to figure out whose fault it is. And that's not to say that history isn't important, right? I mean, you did a nice job helping me bring my history into this conversation, right? And it's formative. It informs who I am and how I show up. So that's not to say the past doesn't come along with us, but there's a difference between having an awareness of that historical influence versus looking to ascribe blame for something that happened before. And then the other thing too is that one thing that organizations in particular are really good at is worrying about the future and saying, well, we need to have a plan and decide where we're going and where we're going to be in the next 3, 5, or 10 years, or whatever the case may be. And sure, we want to have a direction. We want to have a sense of purpose and intent. Let's be clear on where we think we're going. And then let's pay attention really to where we are now, because that's going to influence how we choose to take the next step towards what we think that future is that we want to help, unfold. So, yeah. So I guess bringing that back to white men's conversations. It is about helping us understand who we are and how we're coming to each of the conversations, each of the interactions that we're part of. So context, it's about being clear about the importance of relationships. So it's not just me, Michael, but it's Michael and Susan right now. And anybody else who we imagine might be listening to this who's actually having an influence on the way that we're choosing to have this conversation. So all of those things are part of, for me, what it means to have a complexity-informed view, which feels really different than how I was trained to think in linear cause and effect ways of how the world operates.
Yeah, if I think about the things you've said, trying to understand, there's something about, as you said, the context. You almost need to start off with the now and the context of this is you speaking to me as opposed to some other person. So it's that context. There's the context of the purpose of the conversation, why we're having this conversation, why we're trying to deal with what we're dealing with at that point in time. There is the relevance of what's happened in the past, but that's not the focus. There's what might happen in the future, but again, that is not what we're overly focused on. We're focused on the now and what is needed for the now, and fundamental to the success of that is the relationship that we have, or the relationship with everyone else. Have I done a reasonable good summary of that?
That was beautiful, and I'm glad we're recording this because I can go back and grab that. No, that's very much on point. At least that's how I'm starting to try to make sense of what I understand.
And I'm just then wondering why this is important for organizations. And I'd say almost most especially at a time like this. I'm leading an organization, I'm leading a team, and there's so many going on. I need to be mindful of cost of living, or I need to be mindful of how that might have an impact in the future. And so many other things. But are you saying something different?
I think so. It's a difficult challenge, right? To bring the kind of orientation that we're talking about into most organizations these days, because it's really easy to get enamored of the lingo. Ooh, this is new and sexy. Let's do some of this, and to just kind of stick new labels on some pre-existing practices. And that happens a lot. Oh, our world is so complex now. And so we need to think about different, but let's make sure we do our 5-year plan, and get that written down on paper and go marching on. Anyway, I find I'm still nibbling at the edges when I'm doing work with clients. It becomes about considering the work that we're trying to do right now in this meeting, let's say, at this moment. How can we shift the conversation enough that it starts to make a difference in the way that we orient our minds towards doing the work, to get us, even for a little bit of time, out of the overly linear, direct cause and effect kind of orientation that we've all been trained very well, right, in understanding and operating. So I try to be realistic in the work that I do with organizations about what's possible, and can we, in the moment that we're in, make enough of a difference, ask some different questions, right? Bring some new voices into the conversation. A lot of times that's enough to create sufficient disruption that people start to do things different. It's not magic, right? And it's not anything that's terribly different to what a lot of us try to do already anyway. But there is something about the positioning and the orientation that we take that gets us out of, tries to take us away from cause and effect, predicting the future. If we do this today, then we know this will happen tomorrow. No, actually, we're going to do this today. And when we wake up tomorrow, we're going to ask, how'd that go? Where are we now? And what does that imply about what we have to do next? So it's those small steps that I think can help to start make a difference.
So there's something there about not getting too caught up with the future, even though there are a number of challenges within, but just focusing on the here and now. And perhaps within the here and now are the solutions for tomorrow, but even if not, we'll go on to those later.
Yes, and to be clear, having a sense of direction, understanding together that we're going this way versus this way is really important, because that gives us additional context for the choices that are available to us, right? It constrains to a degree the choices that are available to us, which is appropriate. And then we make this choice, and when we check in at some point to say, all right, we've made this choice, or we've made this series of decisions. Are we still moving in the direction we said we wanted to be moving in? Or do we need to shift a little bit the direction we think we want to move in now, because we've learned some things that we didn't expect to learn before? And what are the adjustments we need to make as a result of that? So it's at the kind of micro process level, it's making sure that we're doing that. To use the lingo, we're building in those feedback loops, right? Or really that we're learning as we're doing these things, rather than just kind of blindly marching off because we said today's Tuesday, so we need to be doing X, Y, or Z.
I think I get that. At one level, it's about eating an elephant, and it's eating the elephant one bite at a time.
Yes.
Yes. But it's also each stage you stop and you look and you do a review what you're doing and come back to it. And if you need to make changes, as opposed to eating the legs first before you eat the trunk, you might review and decide to take a different approach.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And so I think there's some key things that have come through with this for me. There's the whole thing about context, which is what we started with, why I wanted to know about your background. That informs how you see, navigate the world based on your experiences. There is that whole thing about how we deal with complexity, how we have to have an understanding of ourselves before we can see ourselves as part of a group or effectively support other people. And it's amazing for me because one of the things that consistently came through as you've been talking is the importance of relationship. And so for me, that's having the right relationship, the understanding, perspective of others, to have the dialogue, the open, honest dialogue, the trust, the ability to feedback and to continue to be able to do so. And that's great.
That's very well said again, Susan. That's and the relationships thing links directly to the context, right? Because you bring your context as the person that you are with the history that you have to this moment in this relationship, right? And so part of my contribution work, whatever label we want to put on, part of what I do here is to try to expand my sense of what the context is to include your context, right? So we're moving across the contexts that we share, or maybe that we don't share, that we're coming to understand, that we in fact share, at least in this moment while we're having this interaction.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Is there anything else that you'd like us to cover that you think we might have missed for this point in time?
Yeah, I don't think so, Susan. I mean, for me, it's been a lovely conversation, and I've really appreciated how you've heard me and given me a chance to just, flop around here with you in real time to do some thinking out loud together. It's been really very enjoyable.
Well, thank you, and I've enjoyed the conversation. I mean, after all, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
How can people connect with you?
Well, I have a website, which is my company name, Camden Hill International. That's Camden with a P, hillinternational.com. And there's a contact me page there, and email address and all the rest. So that's probably the easiest way, I think, to ask people to be in touch if they'd like to.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed having you on the Leading in the Mosaic World podcast.
It's been a joy, Susan. It's great to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Leading in the Mosaic World podcast. Do visit our website at www.mosaicworld.live to find out more about what we do and how we can be of support to you. Alternatively, connect with me, Susan Popoola, spelt Popoola, on LinkedIn, and let me know what you think of the podcast. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, give it a first-class rating, and tell everyone you know all about it. Thank you.